Hello and welcome to this edition of Group Talk the XSeries, Deploying and Managing XPages, presented by GBS and TLCC, with special guest Warren Elsmore. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome everyone today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. Today we are very delighted to have Warren Elsmore here from Blue Wave in the UK. Warren had done a session in Lotusphere back in January, and I spoke to him and asked him if he could do this session again for our webinar series because I think it's very pertinent. It has a lot of great information that admins need to know and developers need to know as they get done building these shiny XPages applications and want to start deploying them out to the masses. Paul Delanebbia, my partner at TLCC, will also assist us as a co-host on the call, and my name is Howard Greenberg. Just a quick note, we have scheduled the rest of the year for our webinars, and the next one in September is geared for someone who has done absolutely nothing with XPages and who is a Notes and Domino developer and wants to get started. This is going to be for the raw beginner. So anyone who's on the call who's done some XPages work, you probably won't be too interested in this. We're going to start at the very beginning. The next webinar in October will be an introduction to developing mobile XPages using the mobile controls in the upgrade pack / extension library. And in November, we're going to have a very special webinar covering all the new stuff in 8.5.4 from a developer perspective. And we're also hoping to have some special guest speaker to talk about 8.5.4 in general and what it means to the Notes and Domino platform in terms of the social capabilities. And finally, at the end of the year, we're going to wrap up with another Q&A with the XPages experts, which is very popular, where everyone can bring their questions in about anything XPages related. Just a brief word about TLCC. We are the leader in XPages training. We have 6 XPages courses. One of them is totally free. It's a great introduction, and it's going to be actually some of the material we're covering in September's webinar. And we have a JavaScript course for those of you who have not done anything with JavaScript yet, and then some core XPages courses, a special course on mobile XPages, and a new course that came out about a month or two ago on Java 1 for XPages developers. And we'll soon be following that with a Java 2 course. Our courses are self-paced courses. You can learn anywhere, so people have taken our courses all over the world. But we also have the ability to ask questions of our instructors via an integrated discussion database. And we also have office hours where you can participate in an online session and work with an instructor. We also can do private instructor-led courses, either online or we can come to you. And we also have mentoring services where we can help you with your specific application development questions as you're learning XPages. Just a little added benefit to the webinar. You can get 20% off on any TLCC course. If you go to that URL, this offer ends on August 31st. Okay, so today's topic is by, again, Warren Elsmore. Warren is not only a noted administrative and Notes and Domino kind of a minister-type guru, but he's also a Lego master. And here's a picture of Warren with the Queen of the Netherlands. I don't know if those security guys in the background really trusted Warren in this particular picture. But anyway, Warren built this incredible scale model of the Olympic Park that was 250,000 Lego pieces and took, I think, 300 hours to build. And so that's one of Warren's hobbies. He also runs the UK Lego conference that they have that's for adults who are into Lego. And finally, Warren is also one of the people behind the UK Lug, which takes place September 3rd and 4th. So if you're in that area of the world, this is something you definitely want to check out. They got some great speakers lined up, and it's all free, and it's more information is at that URL there. So if you're in the area, UK or in Europe, in general, you might want to look into the UK log. Okay, so we're going to turn things over to Warren. I'm going to pass control over to you, Warren. And at the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A with Warren. So save your questions. And actually, Warren, while you're getting started, I don't know if I can do this now, just to kind of get a feel for who everyone is, let's see if you can take a quick poll to let us know if you're an administrator, a developer, or both. Kind of help us understand our audience today. Okay, so we have some results coming in. Give it another couple seconds. Okay, so I think it looks like we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like we have about 53% of you are developers. And I'll share the results with everyone. And 40% of you are both, and just 7% of you are administrators. So please pass this, you developers, the 53% of you, you want to pass this information on to your admins. This is going to be very helpful for them as you roll out your XPages apps. Okay, so we'll hide this, and Warren, I think we're seeing your screen. I'll turn it over to you. And Warren, we're not hearing anything. Warren, if you can hear me, we're not hearing any audio.
Hello.
Oh, there we go.
Yep, you got me. Cool. Okay. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we have your screen and we hear you.
Fantastic.
Take it away.
So, as I was saying, it's good that there are both administrators and developers on the call, because although my background is administration here, there is a lot of information in here that is useful to developers, and a lot of the content in this is really about knowing the impact of an XPage application on the infrastructure that it runs on. So this is all useful content for both camps. For those of you that are doing both, then you're in an ideal position. So this slide hopefully is becoming less relevant, but for those of you that haven't looked at this yet, for any administrators who are just getting to the point of having XPages applications come into their environment, this isn't a particularly difficult thing to do. At a very simple level, if you sign the database, your XPage is going to work. What we're talking about in this session is really improving the stability of the server, improving the performance of the application, improving the way in which you can manage the application and the application within its environment. But whilst we're saying that, this is all quite new. We've been monitoring the sort of development of XPages applications, and it's very rapid. We're seeing a lot of new applications coming in to the market very quickly. So don't be worried if this feels new. Don't be worried if there are things that don't make sense. In fact, we'll cover a chunk of that in the early slides. We felt the same way too. As Howard said, we first looked at this content for Lotusphere last year, and this really was a question of researching and finding this information out. A lot of it isn't published anywhere. So that kind of sets the scene, I hope. And then what we're going to be looking at is, as I said, a quick recap of what our XPage is, not from a development design element point of view, but from a infrastructure, how do these things work, where is the code running type of thing. We're then going to take a look at installing, installing quote-unquote XPages, but also the extension library, various other pieces around XPages applications. Then we're going to look at the performance of an application, what we can do to get the best performance out of an application, how we deploy those applications to both web browsers and also to Notes clients. And then finally, we're going to look at some security best practices for these as well. So, if there are any admins out there who have yet to sort of have XPages applications in their estate in any anger, yes, you're going to find all sorts of new things, but we can make some fairly simple analogies. You will hopefully know that XPages are a new tool set for designers to be able to develop web and client applications.
Hey, Warren.
They're built, yeah.
Let me interrupt you. And are your slides advancing on your end?
Mine are, yes.
Okay, we're just on your title screen.
Okay.
Let me try making you...
Is that better for you, Howard?
No, let's try try one thing. Let me try making switching presenters to me for a second, and then going back to you. Okay. Well, hopefully that will work. We see your screen now, yes.
Yep, there you go.
Okay,
right.
yeah. It says X what at the top.
Yeah. Well, all you missed was the agenda, so nothing too bad there. So as I was saying, the XPages are a new tool set that the Domino developers can use to create modern client applications for both a web browser client and a Notes client, using a lot of more valuable modern techniques. The difference is, from an admin point of view to what we're perhaps used to, is that the bulk of the code is going to be written in JavaScript. So there'll be server-side JavaScript which is executing on the server, and that's pretty analogous to an agent that's running currently. There's also going to be client-side JavaScript, though, executing within the client. So we've got two areas that we may need to manage and look after. You're also going to hear a thing called Dojo, and for those of you that don't know, Dojo is a framework that is downloaded on the fly to the browser, which lets the web browser do things locally that would be very hard to code from scratch. So we're talking about date and time pickers and calendar pop-ups, things like that. iNotes has done this, has provided these sorts of functionalities for a very long time. But that's a Domino server stored element which we're providing out to clients. So let me just check, is that slide advanced for you, Howard?
It's still on the X what do who slide, Warren.
Okay. Let me...
Warren, there is an option to freeze your screen with the GoToWebinar interface. You want to make sure you're not freezing your screen.
How's that?
Still seeing the X what do who. Do you want to just use the don't use the full screen mode, Warren?
Yeah, let me try this. Is that better for you?
Now we're seeing kind of a, yeah, it's a chart, you know, browser, XPages apps, JVM.
Okay. I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm not going to run through the animation on this slide because I think that might be what kills it. So what I'm explaining here is that within the XPages environment, we've got various different things coming from different elements which are providing the application out to the client. And this is a significantly different thing for an administrator to perhaps be involved in. So if you look along the bottom, whilst we've got the traditional NSF data store, a lot of XPages applications that we're seeing are also working with another backend, a relational database backend. And in in addition to the relational database backend, there are going to be a lot of interactions with the file system, whether that be elements like that Dojo framework being loaded from the file system and sent to the client, or whether that be actual files being read or written to from the file system as well. There's also some other things that are going to be coming through, like the extension library, which we'll talk about in more detail. So as I said, CSS files, resources, things like that. They're all going to be served up via the HTTP task, which means that there's a lot more work going on the web side of things than there has been previously. And the XPages application on the server, which you see as the red box in here, is running within a Java virtual machine. So we have a lot of Java code executing on the server as well. So there are a lot more moving parts than perhaps a traditional pure Notes NSF non-XPages application, but that gives us a much richer client experience, a much better experience. Okay, so you should now be seeing a slide about the XPages extension library.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so this is, for those of you who are developers, you're probably already aware of this. For those of you that are more on the admin side, this is likely to be the first question you're going to be asked. Can we use the XPages extension library? What the XPages extension library is it's a set of pre-built tooling that runs server-side, which allows developers to add additional functionality in easily to their applications. A lot of it's been written by IBM, and it's available on OpenNTF as a free download. So although it doesn't come with the actual packaged product, it is written in a lot of cases by the same people that are writing parts of Notes Domino for you. So it gives developers a jump start to grid functions or UI elements or things like that, and that's the reason why it's a very good thing to use. But it's something that is going to have to change the way in which you may administer and manage your Domino XPages server, because you need to be aware of what's going on there. And there's a warning here that this XPages extension library is updated very, very frequently. So we're talking monthly, weekly, daily in some cases. And that, again, is going to have a knock-on impact to what we do with the extension library from a management point of view. The other thing we're going to talk a little bit about today is XPages in the client. So XPages applications should give us that holy grail of write once, run anywhere, in that we can write an XPages application, it will execute within the client and within the browser. As I said, should give us that holy grail. There are certain caveats. If we're using certain things like the extension library, we need to make sure that extension library is available to the client and to the web browser, and that's done in a different ways. So we're going to talk a bit about how we deploy those and how we manage that infrastructure. So let's have a quick look at installing. Installing quote-unquote XPages is not something you're typically going to have to do. If you're installing a Domino server or upgrading a Domino server, it's an option that is checked by default. So without knowing it, you've probably already installed it. As we said though, the extension library is not installed by default. That's a separate thing we'll look at just now. And we need to be careful at this point with upgrading servers. The extension library is coded against certain versions of the Domino server. The functionality of versions of the extension library varies between point releases. So you may find that a functionality that's used in, say, 852 in the extension library, in 853 in the extension library, that the code functions in a different manner. So you're potentially going to break an application. This is thankfully something that's got a lot better over iterations of the 8.5 code stream, but it's something that you should be aware of. And in reality, this is a point that we would always promote anyway, that administrators shouldn't be just upgrading servers to the latest versions. You need to be aware of the code that's running on them and what's being used. So something to bear in mind. So talking about the extension library, let's look at Domino 852. Effectively, this is going to be a manual install for you to put the extension library onto Domino 852. What you'll want to do is you'll go to OpenNTF, you go to xlib.openntf.org, download the 852 version, again making sure not the 853 version, which you'll find comes down as an update site. You can download that and extract it, and then you copy those files into this long path here, the Eclipse path. Once you've done that, it's a quick restart of HTTP, and HTTP will load in all of these other elements as it starts. You can verify that just by using a HTTP command of tell HTTP osgi ss com.ibm.xsp.xlib. What you'll get out of that is a whole screen full of things, but you will see some elements in there marked xlib for extension library. If you see them, the extension library is loaded, and that's really, even though it's a manual install, that's all there is to it. Now, when we look at 853, we've got a slightly different option. You're again going to be going to OpenNTF and downloading the 853 version, but there's something new we can do here. As of 853, the Domino server supports installation from an update site. So you may have looked at update sites for keeping the parts of the client up to date, but we can now do that for the HTTP stack within the Domino server. So what you want to do in this instance is create an update site on one server using the update site template. We'll extract that update site.zip and then import that into the update site. An important point here, and we'll talk more about this when we get to security, is that the signer of those update site documents must have run unrestricted rights. We'll talk about why that is later. The next thing you want to do is to tell the HTTP stack to use the update site, and that's done through a notes.ini variable. We'd suggest a configuration document. And then once that's done, again, restart HTTP, and you can verify the load using the same command. Two important points about this method. One is that if you have a lot of servers, or you have a load balancing server farm, this is a much easier method of maintaining it, and it's much easier to scale. The other part that is particularly of interest is that using this method, the extension library is dynamically loaded into memory and stored in memory. If we copy the files to the server, then they are referenced directly. With an update site, as the HTTP stack loads, it puts them into memory in case the update site isn't accessible, and they're accessed directly from memory. So there's an impact on performance there, both positive and negative, which again we'll look at shortly. Okay, we talked a little bit about Notes clients. What about the extension library in the Notes clients? Well, same way with lots of other parts of the Notes client, there's more than one way of doing this. What you can do is include it in the original install package. So you can build yourself a custom installation package and include the extension library in there. The difficulty with that is that you're then tying your clients to a set version of the extension library, and pushing out an update is going to be more complicated. Our best practice recommendation would be to use an update site. So we put the extension library into an update site, and that could, or possibly should be, the same one that the server uses, so they're maintaining the same version. Once in an update site, then there are a variety of different ways you can trigger that update site element to be pushed to a client. They are all documented in the Domino admin help and actually in the Developer Works wiki as well. The recommended method is to do this via a widget. So you create a widget to push out the update site updates. It is quite involved, so I haven't got time to do that in detail here, but I've got reference at the end of where to find it. It's in one of the Lotus User Group newsletters that I wrote earlier on this year as well. The final method that you might want to do, depending on the application, is actually look at including the extension library features and plugins themselves into a composite application. Especially if your application is already a composite application, you can push out the other extension library components altogether. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. They're all reasonably valid, but I would tend to steer away from including it in the original install pack. The next thing that you're probably going to come into contact with is Up1, or the Notes and Domino Upgrade Pack 1. So the Upgrade Pack 1 was released in December 2011. It was out just before Lotusphere this year. Effectively what this is a pre-packaged version of the extension library, and also some new templates, so a new team room template and a new discussion template using some of these features. It also provides a thing called Domino Access Services, which is REST services or REST access to Domino data. The main difference from my point of view as an administrator of this is that the Upgrade Pack 1 is fully supported by IBM. So I can call IBM support about any issues I have with parts of the extension library that are included in Upgrade Pack 1. It's not as comprehensive as the extension library, but it contains all of the major elements. So you have a choice here really, whether or not you want to go with slightly less featuresome but fully supported, or whether you want to push the boundaries a bit and go for a bigger feature set, but perhaps have to look at some of that support more yourself or go through OpenMTF. As far as installing Up1 goes, it's a separate executable installer. So it's a separate exe for the Windows platforms for both the server and the client. Once you've run it, you'll find that your version of 8.5.3 becomes 8.5.3.2011 11.20, there you go, end of November, 8.07.17. The reason I've put that in there is it does not upgrade the client or the server version number. So if you ask the client or the server what version they are, they won't be able to tell you whether or not Upgrade Pack 1 is installed. The only way on the server you're going to find that out is if you have a look, you'll see an Up1 directory under the data directory. That'll tell you it's been installed. On the client, you almost have to go down to the level of searching for features and plugins. So it's at the moment it's something you need to be careful about using Up1 in make sure that you document your install fully so you know who has it and who doesn't. The other thing you can do is deploy Up1 via an update site. This is not recommended for the client. That IBM have made that quite clear to us. But for the server, this is recommended. You can use an update site to push it out, create an internal update site, and then you'll be able to maintain a better view on what has Up1 and what doesn't. What we have been told is that Upgrade Pack 2 and onwards will upgrade either a standard 8.5.3 server or an 8.5.3 Up1 server. So although technically not incrementing the client or the server version number should break Smart Upgrade, we're being told that it won't. So that's where we are with Up1. And the other point here, just to sort of reiterate some of the versions of things. As I said, XPages applications using the extension library will be tuned to certain versions. It is important to have consistency across your environment, and you actually have the option in Designer 8.5.3 to save applications so they can run on lower level servers, which is something you may need to do. You're also going to come into the you're also going to become aware of the fact that different versions of Domino ship with different versions of Dojo. So you've got different versions of the framework, different feature sets available with different versions from 8.5.0 up to 8.5.3 and beyond. Similarly, if you're using one UI, which is the IBM UI elements, then you're going to have one UI for each version as well, and that continues to change as XPages are upgraded as well. And Upgrade Pack 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Again, if you're using those features, you're going to need to coordinate. So for the admins out there, this is a much different mindset to what we currently have of, well, we'll upgrade the server because everything works, everything is backwards compatible. We really want to be looking at the applications now to actually see what's going on. So let's take a look at now at XPages performance, which is a really hot topic, I think, for everybody that's deploying XPages applications. The really quick, easy XPage server performance tip is give the server a lot of RAM. Give it some RAM, some more RAM, and then even more RAM. XPages applications are very heavy on memory for a bunch of different reasons. If you think back to that original slide of the architecture, within the HTTP stack, we're now running a Java virtual machine. Within the Java virtual machine, we're running a lot of the XPages code, and that's running your actual application. So we've got a lot of things happening on the server. The more RAM, the slower Domino, the less Domino needs to page to disk, and disk paging is obviously slow. The second point, very related to this, is use a 64-bit OS. Even if you don't have a 64-bit version of Domino, a 64-bit OS will give you a larger addressable memory space, more RAM available, less paging, etc., etc. Another quick one which is useful and not necessarily immediately obvious is to devote fast disk or SSD to your server's program files volume. So as an admin, I'm typically used to having a fast data volume for user NSX, but the XPages code is called for a lot of it from the program files volume. So you need to have fast disk access to those volumes as well. The next point here is to isolate some of your apps. If you've got other memory intensive Domino add-ins such as Lotus Traveler, try and isolate them from your XPages applications, otherwise you're going to be using a lot of RAM. To give you an example, as Howard said, I run the UK Lotus user group, and we have an XPages application that manages registration for the event. We were very often, and this is, it's not a huge application, but we're very, very often seeing 1 to 1.25 gig of RAM being used by the HTTP stack. So on a 32-bit machine with only 4 gig in total, that's obviously an issue. If we'd run Traveler on there, it probably wouldn't have stayed up. So try and isolate your XPages apps wherever you can. And with that point, consider dedicating Domino instances to large applications. If you've got heavily trafficked applications or applications working with a lot of data or a lot of specific configurations, consider a dedicated Domino instance for those. It'll help you really with performance. It'll also help you tune the application so you've got better control over things like versioning. From a development point of view, there's a couple of things that you can set up. You can set your JavaScript to be runtime optimized, and the same for your CSS resources. That's going to dramatically improve the perceived performance of the application. This is especially true if you've got a high latency application, such as something running on a mobile device, or you have users connecting via a wide area network around the world, things like that. If you optimize the runtime, you're going to get a much better perceived performance. The other thing you can do is tune the server page persistence. So if you go into Domino Designer and look at the application properties, you've got the options of keeping pages in memory or on disk. We've found that if you keep pages in memory for a smaller number of users, you're going to get a better performance. It doesn't have to reread from disk. Or as your application scales and you have much larger numbers of users involved, you're better off keeping those pages on disk rather than trying to balance everything in memory. Again, it's about trying to tune where your disk paging is occurring. Some of the other things you can do, which we would suggest, would be to look at a single copy XPage design. So this is reasonably similar to a single copy template in that we only keep one version of all the design elements in a database. Now that's great from a storage point of view, because the example here we have from Declan Lynch, 96,000 databases with the same design, saved himself almost 0.5 terabyte just in design elements there. But another subtle point with this is that if you use a single copy design, those design elements become very small, very often accessed. The server will then cache those design elements in RAM. So rather than going back and rereading things from the database to regenerate views and prepare pages and things like that, a lot of those design elements will be cached by Domino natively. And caching is good. Caching will stop your disk reads So rather than reading half a terabyte, you're going to cache 6 meg. So single copy XPage design is definitely worth looking at. If you want to actually look at the code performance and how and where the delays are coming from in your applications, do look at the XPages toolbox application, which is available on OpenNTF, and that'll let you actually meter your applications, find out what's going on. And for those of you with 853 and above, you can preload the XPage engine. So the Domino XPages engine will actually only load the first time you use it. So if the server's restarted, it's not going to load until somebody calls an XPages application. There's then going to be a delay until that engine's loaded. So if you need to improve recovery times after the server's come back, you can set that preload, set these two values in the notes ini, and it will preload both the XPages engine, and you can tell it to preload a database. So it will actually load that database and get ready to serve that database to web clients. Memory-wise, again, I mentioned memory, and I mentioned, as I said, that it runs within a server-side JVM. But memory is also used for a lot of other things. It may be caching the extension library if we're pulling that from an update side. It may be running other code within the JVM or other add-in tasks. It's also going to be storing state information, so storing information of where the user is on a page, how the user's looking at that page. And that's on top of all the other elements that Domino is also using, all the other add-in tasks that are running, the OS, everything else. So you're going to be using a lot of memory. But similarly, keep an eye on your CPU and disk I/O, because there's an IBM testing document out there where they use an XPages discussion database. The discussion database used about half the network I/O, so there were less calls going backwards and forwards, which made the application much more responsive and much better to use. But that doubled the CIO and quadrupled the disk I/O to a standard discussion database without those features. So keep an eye on that, because your disk I/O is going to be related to your memory. As soon as you start swapping, you'll be calling more disk, which will slow the server down. And XPages is not going to run fast on a slow Domino server. This is a common thing that we see. If your Domino server is not performing well, it's not going to perform well just because you're now using XPages. It will use disk, CPU, and RAM. And for developers out there that aren't aware of this, Domino is hugely disk intensive in everything that it does. All of the performance reviews that I do, if we look at poor performance on a server, it's related to disk performance. So keep a close eye on your disk performance, on what your disks are, how they're being supplied to the server, how they're connected. As we said, if you can use 64-bit Domino, that will give you an increase. If not, certainly a 64-bit operating system with 32-bit Domino will definitely increase your available memory and how much you can page. One thing that comes up fairly recently is this environment variable here, and we see this if XPages applications are just acting strange or crashing randomly, or they worked in development but not in production type of issues, so you know the code is okay. If you have a look at the log files, you're probably going to see Stack Overflow errors or out-of-memory errors, and this is where Domino is telling you it's running out of RAM. So have a look in the notes ini for HTTP JVM max heap size. This is going to be the amount of memory that Domino has to play with for the Java virtual machine, and hence XPages. So in 851 it's set to 256 meg by default. In 852 that was actually dropped to 64 meg because 256 was thought to be using too much memory on the server. You can set that notes any variable to 1 to stop that being reset down, and ideally you want it to be around about a quarter of the total RAM. Again, a point here about 64 versus 32-bit servers. This is all valid for a 32-bit server. On a 64-bit server, the heap size is going to default to a gig of RAM. So as I said, XPages is using a lot of memory on the server. Extra memory is really going to help. Going back to the application development, when you're developing applications, you want to have a look at the scoped variables. So this is a new concept with XPages development that allows data to be temporarily stored in memory. So this is going to give you a good performance boost because you don't need to access that data from disk. You've less read and writes. On the flip side, of course, we've reduced the disk I/O, we've increased the memory needs. So we need to have a look at how much memory we're going to be using, how much caching is going to be using memory, where we are with that. And also, shared variables are per server in memory. So they're not shared across clusters. And if the server goes down, you're going to lose that information. Moving over to the client for a second, we get asked about XPages performance in the client as well. If you're running your XPage application in the client, remember you're actually running the application in the client. It's executing in the client in a similar sort of way to the same time plugin runs within the Notes client. So your memories, CPU, disk overheads are now pushed down to the client rather than the server. Hopefully that's not going to be an issue because all of your clients are running the standard Notes clients and are relatively up to date anyway. But if you've got clients that are running slow in Notes and you push out XPages applications, then they may start having a problem with those as well. The other thing to do is to look at the initial download. So when you initially download an XPages, when you initially open an XPages application, it's going to download the XPages code. So make sure you have network compression enabled to reduce that network traffic, and think about preloading your objects, your XPages objects here, if you've got memory in client. The final thing that I'll add on this page, which we know works and we've seen quantitative data for, is to upgrade the ODS of local databases. And this works for almost any database in Notes, including the mail file. It's something we find very often that when people have local replicas of databases, the ODS is not upgraded very often. But that's something you can push via policy, and it will give you a significant performance increase in the client, even for using your local mail file. One other thing we can look at on this, both valid for server and client, is the session. So you'll be aware that a Domino web app has a normal SSO timeout set. So you log in, your session is valid for, say, 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Once you're done, then you ask to re-authenticate, or you're just dropped. But XPages applications use these, and they also have the session and application timeouts configured in the application properties. And these are different things. They're not the same, don't necessarily have to be the same value, but altering different things. By default, both of these are going to be 30 minutes. So you can increase them or decrease them depending on the type of application. If you've got, again, a very large, heavily used application with a lot of traffic coming from individual users, you probably want to decrease the timeout. So you're not holding thousands of user sessions in memory. You're just keeping them open for a while, dropping them, and reusing that memory for somebody else. If, on the other hand, you have an application that has, so for instance, a very large form that takes the user quite a while to fill out, so you have a smaller number of users and they're on there for a longer period of time, you want to increase that timeout. So the users aren't dropped and then they have to come back in, and Domino doesn't have to go through the overhead of killing a session and then regenerating the session. So have a look at them from both an application and a developer point of view. If you're changing these, you generally want to make sure that your session and application timeouts are longer than your authentication timeouts. So your authentication is the one that goes first, rather than you need to regenerate the session and then regenerate the authentication afterwards, assuming that your server has, as we say, memory to support it. It's all about memory. Everything's about memory. So we've had a look at basics of XPages, installing the XPages components and the performance. Let's have a look at deployment, and then finally we'll move on to security. Some of the development tools that developers will be using, talking with the admins here, are going to require files to be added or changed within the server install. And again, this is not something that we've typically done in the past. Typically in the past, if access to the file system has been asked for, I would probably deny it. But because we're looking at a more complex environment here, running code in various different ways, we need to look at each of the individual parts. And this is usually to do with requirements from Java plugins. So perhaps you would have an application that's using the extension library to make a JDBC call to a SQL database. That's quite a common scenario. We may need to copy the JDBC driver onto the server so the server can access those data stores. Or we may need to open ports, so we may need to open a port to a MySQL server, for instance. So there are things that we'll need to do that are slightly different than we've done in the past. An example of this is a Java security policy file, which we'll talk about again shortly. But there's a Java library called PD4ML, which is fairly commonly used, and we need to give that library extra permissions to be able to run because it doesn't happen by default. And those permissions will be granted through a text file, this java.policy file. So we'll need to add in this extra line here to the policy file to get that running. And that's going to be something that is more common as we go along. Another thing that you may be asked to look at from an administrative point of view is to actually use a different version of Dojo. So although I said different versions of Domino ship with the different versions of Dojo, we can take it further and run different versions of Dojo on the same version of Domino. We would need to download that manually, copy it across the server, and upload it. And if you're looking for where to upload it, that's the directory there, Domino Data Dojo.js. It should go without saying here at this point that the documentation of your application environment is key. A little word about clustering and high availability as well. So I spoke a little bit earlier on about session data, and XPages applications will store state information in memory rather than on disk. So the application will maintain state of where users are in memory. It's not written out to disk. And if you're in a clustering or an HA environment, that's something you need to be particularly aware of. If your server goes down, then the Domino server will go across to a cluster partner and the users will carry on running. But the data may not be there, so the application may not be usable. So that's something that developers need to keep an eye on. If you're using a load balancer, which you probably would be in an HA environment, make sure that you use your stickiness properly so you actually ensure that users stay on the same server. So users don't flip needlessly between different servers. You'll also want to try and distribute your users evenly, so you've got some users on one server, some users on the other server, and never try to fail those over. And a question for the developers out there is, if your application is in a clustered environment, could the code rebuild the user's state? Would the application fail gracefully? Typically what goes hand in hand with clustering is scalability, scaling up and scaling out. As far as view designs and view indexes go, if anything, in XPages these are more important than classic Notes and Domino applications. So we're going to see more of an impact with big views with multiple types of sorting and multiple directions of sorting and large indexes. That's going to have a bigger impact on the performance of an XPages app than it would a standard app. Similarly, the more documents in a view you have, the slower it's going to be. So if your XPages application has one view with every single document in it that is sortable in every different way, that's going to have a big impact on its use through an XPages app. So be careful about how you build your views, keep them as small and as lean as possible. And similarly, readers fields, if you have readers fields on documents and those documents are displaying in a view, that's going to have a big performance boost as well. Your method of battling that is a full text index, and XPages will use full text indexes in pretty much the same way as classic Notes and Domino. So make sure your applications are full text index. Make sure us admins know that full text indexing those applications is important. It's not just for enabling search, it's for actual performance and usability of the application too. I would also, as a server administrator, want to make sure that we have information available from logs. So make sure your applications are logging properly so you can see those errors if they do pop up. There is another OpenNTF project called OpenLog, and I'm referencing here a slide deck from LoadSphere 2012 for those of you that went about how to debug and log Java code that's been written, because we're not necessarily going to see these errors pop up on the Domino server console as we would previously. There is an error page configured for your application properties, so you can display that. And as I say, some errors will be written to server console. We're not going to see everything, or if we do, we're going to see something that's probably of no use to either an administrator or a developer. So keep an eye on that. Finally, if we get any unhandled errors, then the server is going to dump those out straight to the console. But they're also going to be recorded in the IBM Technical Support directory. So you are going to have a location where you can see which unhandled errors are just pumping out and pass those back to see if they can be remedied. So the final section that we'll have a look at in our agenda before we go into Q&A is XPages security, application security. Within XPages applications, we have three different types of session. So we have session, which is just running as the current user with the rights and the identity of the current user. We also have session assigner, so you can run code under the identity and with the rights of the paid person for the ID that signs the XPage. And then finally we have session assigner with full admin rights, which runs it as the signer, so it's logged as the signer, but gives that signer full administration rights to the application. If you're in an environment where your application is going to be audited, and I would suggest even if not, you need to fully understand what you're using and why. As an administrator, I would never give anybody full admin rights unless I know exactly what they're doing, because that would allow that application code to overwrite any ACL tool and do almost anything to any database. So I wouldn't be able to defend that in an audit unless there was an extremely good reason why it needed to be done and there wasn't any other method around it. The difference between your session and your session assigner should be reasonably obvious, but it will let you code things that are perhaps more secure, so you don't need to give the end users rights to things that you run on the back end. As far as ACLs, readers fields, authors fields go, all of those elements will work exactly the same as you're used to. There's no real difference in there. The only real difference is that each of the individual XPages and the custom controls can also have its own ACL. So you can restrict parts of your application from a user, which may cause them to be prompted to log in. It may cause those parts to become invisible or read-only, depending on how you've configured the application. So you've got an extra level of granularity, but all the good traditional design elements we're used to are still there. In terms of best practice, we would always recommend XPages go through the same best practices as a traditional application, in that you have a signing ID. Code is signed by the signing ID by the administrator that puts the application into production. That's good for both the development team and the administration team. The development team can distance themselves from the administration team doing silly things, giving it the wrong rights, which we do, admittedly, by fully documenting what you need, passing it across, and letting somebody else put it into production. It saves you from being involved in that side of it. From an administrative point of view, that's exactly what we want. We want to know exactly what to do, exactly what rights to give something, and then we will do exactly that. So your best practice is exactly the same. Use a signing ID. The XPages applications will also respect your server security settings in the server document over what various code is allowed to do, with one important notice. sign or run unrestricted methods and operations. If you're using XPages applications, you will almost certainly be using parts of the extension library. And that will mean you will have to give that signing ID unrestricted access. The reason being is that that extension library code is being called from the operating system and the file system. So you need to do a file system read to pull those things into memory and execute them. And that in itself is an unrestricted method. So even if your application is only doing restricted things, you will need to give it unrestricted access in order to be able to call the code to do the restricted things, if that makes sense. So for almost all XPages applications I've seen, the extension library has been used, and to load that, I've had to enable unrestricted methods, even though they're not doing actual file I/O, for instance, within the application. If your XPages applications are not signed with the correct ID, you'll get a 403 in the browser, insufficient rights. So again, back to the administration team, get the application signed with the correct rights. The signing process is exactly as usual, so there's nothing different there from an NSF point of view. Again, one caveat, the extension library code that's running within the JVM is running within that Java virtual machine, so it's not going near the domino security, so it's not going to see the server document security. And this is where that java.policy file comes in. So this is where we have control, and it is limited control, unfortunately, over what the extension library is doing on the server running the server side. Client-wise, if we're looking at XPages client applications, there's not an awful lot to look at here. First thing is make sure that no external apps in your notes ini is not present. That would stop most XPages applications working, and a lot of other things as well now. An XPages application will support the client ECL, the execution control list, but XPages running when they're using a Java API will map to the Java Security Manager request. So you need to be careful about how you're mapping things across there and actually where those requests are coming from. And if you're using external Java code in your application, such as the extension library, that will need to be trusted by the client too. So you'll need to do some ECL work. Best practice-wise, your client code should be signed, but you can't sign a feature in a plugin with a notes ID. It's a Java element, so you'll need to sign that with a public certificate. Again, have a look at the references and how to do this. There is again, not too difficult. It just takes a bit of time to sign the code, and then you can push that out, whether that be such as a VeriSign certificate or whether you have an internal certificate sign. Finally, a couple of other things that we want to put in here as well, just to make you aware of. XPages applications, as we said right back at the beginning, can target all sorts of things as a data source. So an XPages application on a shiny new 853 64-bit fully tuned, completely different to the rest of your environment server, could target an old database that's sitting on an R7 server somewhere. So if you're trying to XPage an application that's been in your environment for a long time, you could deploy an XPages application server to run the front end on and use your current server as a data store. There's no need to update the server the actual data is on. If you're doing this, your XPage server is obviously have to be 8.5 or above. The templates for that server also have to be 8.5 or above, your names.nsf template in particular. That means you might need to create a separate domain for your application servers, and that means you may need to do some cross-certification, set up ACLs appropriately. But again, this may be a good thing. If you want to drop in a brand new server into your DMZ, then you can drop that in with a brand new configuration, fully tune it for your nice new XPage application, and just connect back to the data on the R7 server and use notes, directory assistance and various sorts of things like that to manage your user credentials. Very, very common solution that we see implemented. And lastly, the references that we talked about. There's a link there to the performance testing that IBM have done, and also how to deploy the client plugins which in our case would be the extension library via a widget. If you have a look on lotususergroup.org, you'll see some documentation I've done on deploying client plugins, such as extension library via a widget. And there's a long document there on Upgrade Pack 1, which will tell you what's in Upgrade Pack 1, why it's a good thing, why you might want to use it. But with that, I will hand it back to Howard, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Warren. That was great. Okay, we're going to start the Q&A.
And hello, everyone. This is Paul Delanivia. I'm going to help Howard field your questions. We have a few questions in the queue, but certainly continue to post them. Howard, do you have one right now?
Sure. Here's one for Warren. There's no program files volume on Z Linux, so where would the XPages code be stored? From Kathy.
Oh, there's a good one. I will be honest with you and say I have no idea.
Okay.
Z Linux is not something I'm familiar with, but it's going to be in the same area that your Domino executables are actually coming from, like the HTTP and the LDAP task and the SMTP task. So it's in with those wherever they are on Z Linux.
Okay, thanks. Paul, you have one?
Yeah, I have a question from Harry. Can an application have XPages resources from within the application and from a single copy XPage design store? Can you mix and match?
Depends on how your application is done, because it's sort of NSF boundaried on the single copy store. So you can't say within an NSF certain bits are single instance and certain bits aren't. However, if you architect your application so that you have different NSFs, then yes, you could have say one NSF with some of the core code in it, single instance that part, and have other NSFs that reference it that aren't single instance.
Okay, so we have another question from Wayne, and so he develops his XPages apps in a development environment, and then he's moving it up to production. Is there any best practices for referencing things like the server names and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, we would all within the application. I'm sure that Wayne's already doing this. It's best practice to have, say, a configuration panel or something like that where you can put in server names, other fixed things that you don't want to hard code. The other bit of advice I'd give here, and this is what we do internally, is that we have basically a database of databases. So we have a database that just contains information around each of the applications that we have. So it has sort of the gold template that goes out. It has what agents are in that, detailed out, who they're meant to be run by, what ID they should be run under, what level of signing it needs, all these sorts of things. And then our development team, when they're done with an application to go into production, they add it to that database, and that triggers off a little bit of workflow that comes across to my team to say, right, now we need to implement the database, here's all the things we need to do. And that's a really simple way of maintaining that move from development into production. And you can go further and you can version things in that database as well. So that's something that I'd always recommend, because it's not a difficult thing to knock up, and it will really help you in the long run.
Okay, thanks, Warren. And let me add, from a developer point of view, that previously we had profile documents and things like that for Domino applications, and of course you can still access those in your XPages. But we also have this new thing called application scope variables, and you could set up some logic that when your XPage first loads, you load some of those server name, database names into the application scope variables, and then those stay in memory and are shared among all the users. So that would be a quick way, performance-wise, to access some of these configuration variables, as opposed to reading, doing lookups every time you need to figure out a server name. Warren, I also had a question. Have you seen, in terms of people accessing data on another Domino server, like you mentioned, the Domino 7, database, that you can put a shiny, XPages front end on it. Have you seen any performance implications when you're pulling the data from another server?
Assuming that your environment is in a good state and you're getting low latency responses, you shouldn't see too many performance implications. It's going to be an NRPC call to your R7 server, and that's a very well tuned thing. So as long as there's nothing slowing the conversation down in the meantime, then you're not going to have any problems with it. No, it should be fine.
Thanks, Warren. Paul, you have another question?
I have a question from Peter. Will XPages work with jQuery? If so, how easily can I apply it? Will it interfere with the Dojo framework?
Ooh, Howard, have you got any input on that one?
Yeah, I haven't myself, but I know Marky Roden has done a lot of work with jQuery, and so it definitely works with jQuery. And it doesn't look, I've read a couple of his articles, it looks fairly easy to apply it, and I don't think it interferes with Dojo. I think it's kind of a totally separate thing. So so you might want to look up Marky Roden. It's R-O-D-E-N, I believe, and he's has a blog, and he's done a lot of stuff on jQuery and XPages for Peter. Okay, we have another question from Oscar. Warren, does the settings we do in the session application timeout supersede or override the server HTTP timeout settings?
It's effectively whichever comes first. So whichever timeout gets hits first, that's the one that's going to take effect.
So it's best to make those about the same?
Yeah, typically it would be easier to set them all around about the same. I mean, if you've got really long operations that are timing out, then you probably might want to look at whether or not you can chunk that up, split it down a little bit. But yeah, otherwise it's typically easier to set them about the same, and then you're not going to have half of an application call timeout.
Okay, thanks, Warren.
Okay, I have a question from Vinay. What are the challenges for deploying XPages in a clustered environment?
So your biggest challenge is probably the one that we mentioned there in terms of the session state and working out what you're going to do when one of those cluster members fails. And it's about sort of gracefully failing that user over when something happens, because you're going to lose everything that's in memory when one of the node fails. And if you're writing for a clustered environment, you do have to assume that one of the nodes is going to fail at some point. So that's your biggest challenge. Secondly, I would say work really closely with the networking team to make sure your load balancer is configured correctly and is properly distributing users or not distributing users, as the case may be. Any sort of web-based cluster application, you need to have a really good understanding of where your users are going, which server they're hitting, when they're going to flip between the different servers, because that's going to have the same impact as a server failing. A user's going to go to a server, make a request, and the server knows nothing about it. So I'd take a good look at those two things first off. Your other areas in terms of performance, scalability, all those sorts of things, that's all very common to a single server environment.
I have a question from you have one, Howard?
Go ahead, Paul.
A question from Yoon. What's the best way to debug server-side JavaScript?
Now this is one, and again, Howard, unless something's changed in the last few months, this is one that came up when Matt White and I were talking about this at Lotusphere. And I think the answer was there isn't a really good way of doing it.
Well, it's kind of outside the scope of today's topic. I would say, well, one thing is come in November to our webinar on 854. You're going to be very happy to see a server-side JavaScript true debugger. Otherwise, the only other way is to use print statements. One of the things you might want to look into is the debug toolbar that's available on OpenNTF. That way you can make it real easy to write debug lines of code to your sort of like the console without having actually a server console in front of you. So that's typically, you know, until 854 comes out, that's the best way.
Yeah, and I'd support that. That debug toolbar is something that I use all the time, and I seem to be adding to all of my applications. So certainly good in the interim while we're waiting for the improved way in 854.
Okay, here's a question, Warren, by Nude. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, Nude. The gotcha sign or run unrestricted methods in operations. Is it only relevant with external library or extension library and not with upgrade pack 1?
No, it still applies to upgrade pack 1 as well, because that's again coming from the file system. So it is going to hit pretty much every XPages application.
I've got a question from Peter. What's the best practice for maintaining and upgrading XPage applications in production? Should we schedule downtime? And let me add to that for maintaining and upgrading the extension library or the upgrade pack.
Okay, so I think there's probably kind of two things there. One in terms of maintaining and upgrading, etc. I'd come back to really good documentation and good testing. So your server management team will know if an app written in 852 will work in 853 or not, because hopefully it's been tested in development already. So I would really keep an eye on that. In terms of general sort of management, what I would tend to do is look at using either using the tools within Domino or using a third-party tool. Keep an eye on the process usage of your server and the memory usage of server and things like that, because you will find that a big application is going to use a lot of RAM, and that RAM isn't going to be released on a necessarily on a particularly regular basis. Now that's not a problem if you've got the RAM in the server and you're caching. You don't want to dump 2 gigs worth of cache if you've got that there. But then again, if you've only got 2.5 gigs worth of RAM and 2 gig of it's been eaten up, you are actually going to find that a recycle of the server is actually going to free it up and make the server perform a lot better. In that instance, I'd say look at the underlying hardware first rather than you actually implement repeated restarts. But if you're not in a position to do that, then it is going to help.
Okay, we have a question from Baba on readers and authors fields, and do they work the same as in the old client application?
Yeah, simple answer is yes.
Let me add a caveat to that from a developer point of view is that unless you have the run form validation and option set on your document data source to run what they call the form validation on save or on both, or unless you in your code set the flags to make it a reader's field or author's field, there will be some issues in actually getting those fields set up if it's a new document, and you're creating it in the Domino database from your XPage. So that's something I know we cover in our courses, and you probably find it out on the web as well. But something you need to be aware of, that just saying in the domino form that something is an authors or readers field and then using it on your X page will not be enough. You have to take a few extra steps.
Okay, I've got a question from Harry related to XPages and clustering. On failover in a cluster, how does the XPage app know that this has happened? What information in the current context is available and saved?
Again, Howard, you can correct me here if there's anything you can add to it, but as my understanding, it doesn't. You know, that session is in memory, so once that server's gone, that session's gone.
Yeah, what I do is in the wherever I'm initializing the various scope variables, typically in a before page load or after page load event, I preface that with one big if statement, checking all of them for null. Because if for some reason, I guess if it I've never seen, you know, I've never experimented with clustering, but if for some reason your session goes out of scope, maybe just times out because the user left the page open for a while, then you need to reload or reinitialize all those scope variables. So it's a question of making sure that you're testing those variables wherever you're initializing them to see if you have to reinitialize them.
Yeah, this is why I was sort of saying about graceful failover. You know, it's going to happen. It's just you need to, if you code around it, you can make it a better experience for the user.
Question from Kathy, a technical one, and I'm going to answer this one. Can you, will the Q&A be available later? For the Q&A, you can save that by going into your GoToWebinar session and its file, what is that? File, save questions log. So that's how you save the Q&A. And in terms of Warren's presentation and a recording of this webinar, both will be available, and you can expect a follow-up email from Adam with all the details on how to access those.
And that concludes this edition of Group Talk. Thanks for watching. To engage in conversations with us, visit twitter.com/gbsknows. To stay up to date, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/joingbs. And to watch entertaining and informative videos, visit youtube.com/gbsknows. And don't forget, visit our website and send us an email at gbs.com and info@gbs.com. Thanks again.